and steel during the 20th century, but before the consent decree of 1972, before wartime production, we had Rebecca Webb Lukens. And in 1825, she guided the nearly bankrupted family business known as the Brandywine Ironworks and Nail Factory. And it's an honor for me to introduce Catherine Quillman from the National Iron and Steel Heritage Museum to tell us more about this fascinating Ironmaster today. Catherine Quillman is a former arts journalist with the Philadelphia Inquirer and the author of 8 regional histories. Catherine is a researcher and writer at the National Iron and Steel Heritage Museum in Coatesville, Pennsylvania, it is now the site of the oldest continuous working iron and steel facility in the country. So please join me in welcoming Catherine Quillman.
Thank you. It's the National Iron and Steel Heritage Museum, and basically it's comprised of all the buildings that were a part of Lukens, including this executive office building. If you think you're in Williamsburg, it's because the architect developed that style, of course, colonial revival, and they did everything between putting bonded brick and that kind of thing. But it was a vast improvement when they built this over having a little office in the actual mill to be very dirty. But Lukens was always a custom mill, so that meant if they were dealing with locomotive barons, they probably didn't want to see other competitors working, what kind of business was going on. So it was good to be able to have a central office. These are just some more buildings. The one on the right is where Rebecca Lukens lived. It's called, I always joke, it's called the Brandywine Manor, and you think, oh, it's so small. But it turns out that they, when they were expanding a road called First Avenue, they just sort of lopped it off in 1910. And so she had a little bit larger house. But all the houses there, actually, there's 5 houses, but other ones, the family was sort of oriented, they were Quaker descent, and they didn't have that many sons, so they didn't want to leave the house to the daughter, so they would give their houses to different groups. In fact, the one down the gravestone, that was given to the city hall. They had it in 1939 till 1995. And the houses now, one of them is still the Blind Association and the VFW place. This is just a rundown. People remember that Bethlehem Lukens, they were at one point, I just realized that right before 9/11, that's when, right the month after October, after 9/11, that's when Bethlehem claimed bankruptcy. But then ArcelorMittal took over, and now it is a working steel mill. It's sort of across Brandywine, and we are trying to get a relationship where we have manufacturing days and people come out to meet this Coatesville School District with cliffs. They usually are called Cleveland Cliffs, and they're actually the 4th oldest in the nation. So we were glad that they were able to keep going. Okay, here's Rebecca. This is an older picture of her. We call her the nation's first industrialist because basically she did all the management of the mill. She didn't do the physical work, of course. In my area, they call it the Iron Country. The first iron forges in the nation were there. I'll tell you about that later. And there were a lot of people that say their husband died and then they would take over, but they would not do the takeover as much as Rebecca. And it's primary because she was Quaker and was educated at Westtown School, which is the oldest boarding school in the country. She also learned the business. She was the oldest child, and she learned the business from their father. So we'll meet him. His name's Isaac Pennick. Actually, the family is really in the news now because the Pennick family were really involved with the Underground Railroad. But as far as we know, Rebecca was so busy that I don't think she had time to do it. But the Pennicks are a very wealthy family in terms of farming, and they also did agricultural implements. They invented all these different things, including actually later on one of the first snow plows and other kind of things. But anyway, Isaac decided he wanted to go in the iron business, and his parents say, "Oh my goodness, you're going to fail. stay with farming, because at that point, Chester County, where this area is from, they used to call it the breadbasket of the colonies. It was very rich in all sorts of things, and the farmers made lots of money by selling wheat abroad and Caribbean and all sorts of things. Again, he was the first in the family to enter the trade, and he started what they call a federal slitting mill in South Coatesville, and I'll show you a picture of why it's called a slitting mill. And then he ended up expanding to moving to Coatesville and buying this sawmill from Moses Coates. That's why it's called Coatesville. For some unknown reason, Moses Coates went to Phoenixville, got out of the saw business, but years later, he was famous during Valley Forge encampment that Benedict Arnold stayed at his house and had a lot of parties and that kind of thing. But anyway, the Pennock homestead is called Primitive Hall, which is sort of an ironic joke because it's obviously not, when it was built, it was not primitive at all. It looked very much like the Georgian mansion. To the left is what they call the federal slitting mill. That's the ruins. There's nothing left of it now, but he had that and he did pretty well, enough to expand to Coatesville. Now, all of these are water-run mills. This is to show you that he had lots of competition in the beginning. Slitting mill is basically you make slits of iron, and it's used for, say, to make nails. That's why a lot of colonial nails are flat because they're rolled, or hoops on barrels or wagon wheels. It was sort of limited. But this is to show you on the right, is to show you the map of all the industrial areas. The reason why it's the first iron forges and furnaces in Chester County was because William Penn actually was told by the Indians that they found iron ore that was really easily mined. It was to the surface. So he invited all the English ironmasters to come here. Plus it had lots of limestone and there's lots of trees to make charcoal. So the earliest forge I think was 1701. And actually this forges and furnaces which supplied pig iron to Lukens, that they were pretty much from the 1700s to the 1940s. Here's a picture of the limestone, except we don't have charcoal. This is like coal. They switched to coal later on. There were like 5 other mills besides Lukens, including the Worth brothers, and they had blast furnaces, but we kept with open hearth, which was, it used these 3 ingredients to make iron. This is to show the map of when he picked this area because, he picked this area because not only the Brandywine was there, they could have water power. Brandywine actually had 150 mills on it. It goes from Honeybrook and it's 60 miles down. It goes down to Wilmington. But it also had Route 30 is the first turnpike in America. It was the first paved turnpike. So it was a great place. And later on the railroad came through there. This is an updated thing. You can't even see where today you would have the mill would be all around there. It's all filled in, of course. Like this would be the main area. I just wanted to show you that because they had to rely on, having a mill dam because you have to divert the water in order to run the water wheel. Actually, Rebecca had to learn all this. She had to fight for water rights and other things of people taking your water up the upstream. There were so many different angles that you had to learn besides just knowing how to make iron. This is a really neat picture. It was one of the relatives left the ironworks and went into having the first bank of Coatesville, second in Chester County. And this is before they had the Federal Reserve. These banks could just crank out their own money. So they had Lukens on the like $5 bill, and they had another part of Coatesville on the $10 bill. But you could see that Isaac Pennock, Rebecca's father, was sort of a genius in terms of making this automated. Like this is pretty modern because you could see the water wheel in the back, and they're supposedly don't have as much work to do because all these, it helps assist, these things assist in terms of the cutting of the iron. Here's another model we have too. Again, it's the slitting mill. That's an industry term you don't like hear anywhere. And I never knew exactly what it was until I started working here. Okay, here's Rebecca. It's a painting of her younger. This is soon after she got married at age 19. I noticed she has a book in her hand because, of course, she's a reader. We have accounts of her, too, that said that she took chemistry and mathematics and all sorts of things that would be closed off to her if it wasn't at Westtown School, and that was one of her favorite subjects. In fact, we had a Lukens Life magazine that was sort of modeled on Look magazine or Life magazine, and they had like 4 full-time photographers, and they would go back and they would find some little issues or something that and publish her account books, because we were fascinated in the 1950s, saying that, oh, she was using things like cost of goods sold. The way she balanced her books were just very sort of modern. She gets married, and this is what changes everything when she gets married to Dr. Lukens, he was a doctor, but he gave up his medical practice, and he first worked with the father in Rokeby, that was south, the first federal slitting mill. But she pretty much helped work with them because he didn't know anything about the iron industry, so she pretty much had to guide him. They had 6 children. She only ended up raising 3. We'll see that from all the different things that she took over. I thought it was interesting that he did want to go back to Philadelphia and continue. Of course, he probably used his medical degree anyway, because there's always accidents in the mill. But he ended up having to lease the place, and with the understanding that the father would give the mill later, and he had to put all this money into it. We'll see this later. Again, they lived in the Brandywine Manor house. You see the lower house, that ended up being the company store. So here's this colonial, it's on the National Register, 1734, and they just added this company store. She had it, I'll have to tell you about, she had her own company store, but this was a later one from the 20s. In fact, what we were talking about, the reason she was the first industrialist, because she did everything from write contracts, handle sales. In fact, these sales are really big. This is after they developed boilerplate on the steam age. She actually supposedly sent like salespeople down to New Orleans to see if they could sell to the steamboats. Because basically it's her father's firm started in 1810 and the first steamboat was 1818. But actually after she was sort of forced into taking full control after her father died without a will, and then she had to contest it, and then her husband died soon after. But she ended up working with her brother-in-law and getting everything going again, even though it was almost bankrupt. In fact, it's sort of interesting, back in the 90s, Fortune magazine featured her, saying that she had very modern ideas. They featured a lot of other people at Colonial, but she was the only female. And they said, oh, she did all the things you think now, like this is the spend money to make money. Like even though the mill was falling apart, they had a flood that took out the dam, she just tried to raise money, and she also had to, a lot of people helped her since her husband had died, and they gave her things on credit, and so we recently bought letters from this auction house, and we tried to apply for a grant in terms of figuring out how she would beg to say she had to keep everything meticulous to say, I borrowed this penny from you. But some of them were like $1,000, which is a lot back in 1825. She also put a new water wheel in and a new flywheel, and a flywheel makes it more efficient. It's like a second wheel, and furnaces. I always said it was interesting that she also kept a garden, because again, we call it the Fortune magazine called it the corporate culture, that you keep your workers happy. They could have gone to so many different places. There were textile mills. Every time the water was low, they wouldn't be able to run the mill. So she would do things like have them work on the farm, or everybody had sort of a communal garden. I think it's interesting, the garden is right next to the mill there. But we also have, this is to the left, just to the, this is your left. it's a museum now, and the one tenant house we have left. Someone donated something that was so old, it turned out to be a Rebecca rose that was maintained. A relative had gotten it from her like in the 1800s. But you know how you could keep roses, you know, they grafted and they developed it. So we recently planted the Rebecca rose again. I also point out that, as I said, here, this is why I was driving through Bethlehem. I noticed the town was sort of on the hill, and that was sort of the same with Coatesville. You go any place else, if you ever look at textile mills or other things, you always see the owner's on the hill. You know, he's up there, and the workers are down in the, you know, the dredges. But here it's exact opposite. In fact, you can imagine with this open house, at one point they had 34 stacks. You know, even through the 40s and 50s, they said you had to find out when they were going to have a blast because you don't want to put your laundry out there. But this is a really remarkable house, the Terracina, 1850. It's Gothic, and this is the only house that was taken down, unfortunately. But you can see that this was also one of the grandsons took this picture from another house across the street. But you could just see how everything, it was sort of still a farm in a way. And 1940s, the U.S. Navy came and built what they called the 120 mill. And Mr. Stewart, Rebecca's relative, he begged them not to build it a certain place because that's where his barn was, and move it down this way. Okay, so as I said, in 1934, this is her husband had died, her father had died, and she just found herself having to run this mill with the help of her brother-in-law. And I said she kept, created what they call corporate culture. This is the Fortune magazine talking, by building the company store, not the one that we saw, it was an earlier one, worker houses, and they weren't just framed, they were stone houses. And she also thought of new markets, like in England, and she built a large warehouse and set up a freight stop, of course, and she was one of the first advocates for having the train. In fact, the train here is now called the main line, but during 1833, the train was really early because it was state-owned. The state was competing with the Baltimore canal system, and so they wanted to have all these canals, and they built the train so quickly that they couldn't even have locomotives. They drove them by horses. But anyway, that became a whole market with this. She also believed in, like, what are you to do when you have to get iron, pig iron, which you probably know that pig iron is named for the fact that when it's poured, it looks like suckling pigs, so they call it pig iron. So she would have to get pig iron like 20 miles away and by wagon and bring it in and then heat it up again. So at one point, now this is when she passed away, but they, you know, her ideas were still that we need to have a conversion. The Pudden mill, this is the original 1810 mill, they converted into what they call a Pudden mill. And that means they make everything there. You know, you don't need to, you're basically making pig iron there. And that, of course, that saved a lot. Here's another picture of the corporate, the company store. It was funny that when I first started in the 20s, they only had men, and I always wanted to know whether or not the men would feel like slighted, like, oh, I want to work in the steel mill, I'm a man, you know, but you end up going to work in the store, which you had to wear the long aprons and that kind of thing. In fact, they didn't have anybody that could walk in there. You had to go in there and give your order, and they would get you the things. But later on, it became like a regular grocery store. And people really, actually, we did a story on this. People really loved it because anybody, it was more like a cooperative store, not a company store. And people from Coatesville, they would all go there, and they always supposedly had, since we had farm country around, a really good butcher shop and everything else. And you know, they would share. It was so people that didn't even go to live in Coatesville would come to the store. Like Bethlehem, we also had, you know, ambulance. We had our own fire truck, that kind of thing. But getting back to Rebecca again. Things happened pretty quickly. She got married at 1813 and 19, and then they leased the Brandywine Iron Works. As I said, it was not called Lukens then until later. And then she moved in Coatesville into that little manor Brandywine Manor House, started having children. But as I said, they probably would have gone out of business if they stayed with just nails and hoops and that kind of thing. But Dr. Lukens realized that we were going to have another product, and the steam age was coming. So he invented, they call him the inventor, a boilerplate, which now we think boilerplate's the legal term for little fine print, but back then it was boilerplate was used in boilers. In fact, he developed his 1818, and the first Savannah, the first steamship. In fact, you notice this. There's the paddle there. He developed. That was pretty the same year. So he was inventing this very quickly. We actually have in our display in our museum, we have the day of, that shows the records, and it has outlined 1818, the exact date, March or whatever, that say this is when I rolled the first boilerplate. In 1824, Rebecca's father died, and her infant son also died. And just when they were just getting their biggest order, that was the first order. Again, remember I told you the state had the canal system that was on the Susquehanna. And so it was used in iron-hulled ship and steam operated. It's ironic, that's 1825, and their reputation for building ships were so great that that's why the U.S. Navy came and built their own 120 mil, and then they leased it back to Lukens. In June, that's not very far. So here's they're thinking everything's going great, and then Dr. Lukens dies at the age of 39, and he only verbally promises the mill, and she was pregnant with her sixth child at that time. Unfortunately, we have still tried to figure this out. Her mother was very either jealous or she was always disputing things. In fact, she had a competitive, she opened another mill with her son, trying to make, this is before they did boiler rate, but they were trying to compete as well. But she disputed the ownership and said that, no, he left the mill to me. So she had to dispute this, and at the same time, she had to fight with water rights, and then also there were tariffs over American goods. She was trying to, sell the boilerplate to Britain. There were lots of floods. Second son, Charles, also dies at 7. So all this is happening right when we have the new product, and that was when you remember the Tom Thumb. They had at Ellicott City, they had a race with the horse and the steam, the locomotive, and actually the horse won, but of course that went on to make history because locomotives were going to be a big thing. That was their huge product. They made fireboxes that would go in the steam, and after the locomotives, the steam locomotives went out of business, they started making the steel for the undercarriages. So in 1934 was a high point for the mill's production of boilerplate because they not only had it for locomotives, they also used the iron rails for railroads. So they were pretty much doing really well then. And then she had to do things like more floods. And then the panic of 1837. That's like a national one, had to do with the financial crisis in the banks and trying to go under the gold standard. But she survives that because of the mill's reputation. There's all sorts of things where she writes letters to the people all the time and thanks them, and it sort of like says, oh, we do things well here. She's, before they even had such a thing as a marketing campaign, she did that. In 1844, her mother dies, and then even though her other relatives, her mother was Webb family, but the Pennick's relatives contested, and she almost went to the state Supreme Court, but they settled out of court, and so she had to raise all this money to buy them off and things. She actually bought her mother off too. 1846, she finally becomes sole ownership of the ironworks, although her son-in-law also was a partner in it, or I should be full partner, but she basically owned the place and he was an assistant. That's a picture of him. He's the one that went into banking after a while and developed that. He was married to one of her daughters. It's interesting, he had two doctors, Dr. Lukens and Dr. Charles Houston. He married Rebecca's daughter. She had two daughters. I said two, ended up actually had three daughters, but one of them died at childbirth, and she ended up having to raise her grandchild. But anyway, a family of doctors. He also gave up his medical practice. But what's interesting about him, he did bring a lot of scientific ideas in terms of testing. He started to do more steel because he thought we're going to add limestone and make steel stronger. And he becomes the president of was Lukens Iron and Steel Company. At one point, even though their name's Houston, they switched to Lukens in honor of Rebecca and her husband. It's interesting, a lot of things she went back, we know about her because she wrote an autobiography, and she was talking about the difficult time of having to marry her husband, and then after her father died, having to run this mill. And it says, I thoroughly repaired the mansion house, built good and substantial tenant houses for my workmen, put time and fencing on the farm. But she had to contest, she remembered things. I had built a very superior mill, and here she sounds very Quaker, everything through a plain one. And our character for making boilerplates stood at first in the market. And that was ironic because they're the only ones that made boilerplate at that point. And hence we did as much business as we could. Other people tried to do that later on. At the same time, she also had to write lots of volumes of things because in 1850 she was again having to dispute inheritance. And she said, you ask what advancements I received from my personal property from my father, Isaac Pennick, left in charge of my mother for the benefit of his children. I answer not. She didn't get anything. So she had to fight that. And then it said everything was in dilapidated state about the mill, the house, the farm. So much was to be done that Dr. Lukens was quite discouraged, and although the rent agreed upon was low, the numerous repairs raised it to more than he thought it was worth. So the key is, I wonder how he thought about, going into boilerplate and saying that, they would have gone out of business, again, just staying with the nails. About this time in 1850, this is Dr. Charles's house. There's legend that she gave this as a wedding present. This is a painting on the side. People love this house. It's a Gothic house. But she's Quaker. I don't really think she would, she lived next door. I don't think she would, sort of say, oh, this is a house, I'm going to give it to you. But he was a doctor. He was already substantial, and he went into, he had plenty of money himself. In fact, other people say that he made this from a pattern book by this famous guy named Andrew Jackson Downey. So these same houses are up in Newport. Although I say with all the Lukens houses, by comparison, they're all so small. Like you go to, there's a Greystone in Westchester. It has a library and I call it the Clue board game because it has the library, the conservatory, with Dr. Peacock. It has all these rooms, and yet the Greystone in Coatesville, it only has a library and a music room, and that's dining room. In fact, the servants' quarters are bigger. But anyway, but that might be sort of influences of the Quakers. There's lots of beautiful trees too, because she maintained a garden. But in fact, this is a magnolia tree that one of the relatives, they married. Actually, two brothers, they married women from Savannah, and they brought back these magnolia trees. So it's sort of neat to see the southern, and they survived probably because of all the pollution over the years. It's warmer, it seems like, in Coatesville. Here's Dr. Houston again. I said what he started to go into steel is and I'm sure they did this in Bethlehem, but he developed what they call the testing of steel products. Every time you made a steel product, instead of just letting it go, you would take a little piece off it and you would stretch it, you would bend it. I always joke that those people got paid to break things in their things, but you can see it over here in 1940. This picture, this is from they're waiting. They do like a miniature ingot and they pour it and see what, and then they test it in the lab and make sure it needs more different additions to it. Oops, sorry. Again, we're going to get back to Rebecca here. The first open hearth was 1891, and that's what you really need for steel. And they pretty much did the same thing. It was the same procedure they did for years. In fact, it wasn't until like 75 that they switched to electric arc. But it's still a rolling mill. So a rolling mill is some 1810. So it's how you heat the steel at the end. There's still the rolling mill, but you had blast furnaces up here, which they needed a lot more coal, I believe. Okay. In fact, this is, I said 1849, she retires, but she remains a silent partner. And the same time, that's when her daughter dies of childbirth. So I have to look at the dates. I think she retired after she had to take over her daughter, her granddaughter, because she might not have retired otherwise, but she becomes a silent partner. And you can see now it's called the Lukens Iron and Steel Company, and eventually they dropped it and they just call it the Steel Company, but they're still using the old 1810 slitting mill in their ads, because they're very proud of their family, history. And we're just getting, here it is, the Lukens rolling mills. Houston is the Rebecca's son-in-law, and Penrose was her nephew, and they were in business, but they basically changed it to the Rebecca Lukens, or Charles and Rebecca Lukens rolling mills. This is a picture of it, looking at when they had lots of blast furnaces. Again, their catalog, you could see they show, they love to be able to show their beginnings, and you see the row houses too of all the company, the housing there. There we go. Her grandchildren were also Quaker. They were educated at Harvard College, which is sort of a Quaker school, and they were interesting in terms of just like the family, they wanted to. They were like ahead of their times in terms of marketing and a lot of people, work, having a sales force, meeting your customer, taking care of your customer. And originally they had their offices in their homes, but Abraham is the one that actually built that executive office building you saw. That he hired the best architect to build that. He actually three daughters, and his widow is the one that gave it to the city hall. One thing they did too, to show that they would always be testing things, and they said they invited all the boiler makers in the country. They're probably a lot by 1912, and they deliberately would blow it up, and they would say, because we have the world's largest plate mill, we have less trivets, I guess, so you call it, the dividing things. They had special way of putting these things together so they wouldn't blow up. But everybody else, they would time it. This happens to be out in the landfill there to the Coatesville. And there's about 4 or 5 boilers, and they would deliberately blow them up. And Lukens, after 5 minutes, someone, I think it lasted 5 minutes or 10 minutes, but the Lukens product was not blown up. And this was actually a big thing, because as steamboats, if you took your life in your hands earlier in 1818, if you got on a steamboat, because you didn't know whether it was going to blow up or not. So they're also famous for developing what they called the world's largest plate mill. And going towards the end here, in fact, it was that way. We call it the largest in North America, because they still use it at the mill. When I say mill, I mean the structured thing. That was 206 inches. And when I first started working, I was thinking, that's not very wide, but it is wide in terms of steel, because they would crack and things, but they developed it. First it was 204 inches, and now it's 206. Now, after World War II, Japan made one that was a little bit bigger, so that's why we can't call it the world's largest plate mill. I also joke that they would have all their advertisements, and they would I would say they would get the shortest employee to show him how he's next to, how it's so big, turn that off. There's a steel mill. So anyway, so they were very inventive. This is actually from 2016, and I was told that Cleveland Cliffs every once in a while uses this. This is the one that was built in 1917, but as they said, they use electric arc furnaces, but at the end, if they have a small thing they want to do, they still use this mill because it makes the 206 inches. So anyway, that's the end of my presentation. There's the our parade. We have the executive office building in the back. So does anybody have any questions or anything? Yeah.
First of all, this is really good. It's a whirlwind tour.
I do. It
Lots
is.
of fun.
Thanks.
I feel as if I've learned a lot, had
Yeah.
a lot more to learn. But one of my questions is about the workers.
Yes.
In the early 1800s.
Yes.
What was their background? I mean, were some of them Quakers?
You know, it's funny. They were. We have this actually memorial put up for all the people that lost their lives at Lukens, and I usually like in Downey towns nearby. There's lots of Italians that worked in the paper industry. There's so many Quaker. There's old English names, and I also thought of that too when I didn't say that she tried to make a community. I forgot to say that she also started a saddle shop at the warehouse and things. They seemed to be, at that point, they weren't necessarily Quaker. Quaker in Chester County, where she lived, was like southern Chester County was 90% Quaker at one point, like the 1850s and that kind of thing. But you wouldn't, the Quakers, I guess, they were always so nice in terms of business. They would help each other, so they weren't really competitive. So I think the employees would not necessarily Quaker when I look, but they're all English names. But the fact is that we have to do more of the research. The fact that she built these houses for them, and then they would have farm things, and way back, in fact, Lukens was always that way. The culture, people say they also believe in education, that they taught. You would go there, and Bethlehem would give you classes and things, and every secretary had to learn how to what goes into steel. So she knew what they were talking about. They would take like chemistry, the classes in steel making, but it's still one of those processes where I said they reprinted her account books and her diary in the Lukens Life magazine because she was always encouraging people to be sort of like equal and helpful, but we don't know that much. They didn't write like anybody else. They don't write down people's names very much, I mean, I noticed that they didn't have the servants' quarters. They have like one floor, but then the other, when they built Greystone, this grandson, they had a wing, like so your servants weren't overhead, like they were almost equal at that point, and the chauffeur was there, and they would call them a friend, and they never had the executive dining room either. So it was people who were, on equal terms. And then they had different hats for people. The white hats were supervisor and other things. But I was told that pretty much the equality probably has been left over from her days.
Well, what's so fascinating is before I came in here, I would hear the term company store.
Yeah.
And I think Pullman Company,
Yeah.
outside Chicago or West Virginia,
Oh, yeah.
old country, and it was a bad thing. This has a very different kind of benevolent.
Oh, I know. I should have corrected myself. It was not a company store. It was cooperative store.
Okay.
And then they had little stocks you could buy into it. You could buy, and as I said, other people from Coatesville, they didn't make it, open to only Lukens employees. Other people would go there too. So it really became part of the whole Coatesville area. And it was lasted a long time. It was actually, when they had to take it down because it was tearing down the colonial house there where she lived. It was hard with the water damage and everything. They just sort of built it next to it. But it lasted from that one, not even counting her one was long ago. But anyway, 1921 to 2009, I think it was. And 2009, but for some reason they didn't keep it going. Bethlehem, I told you, was at that point there, and during the, I didn't show, one of the earlier things you saw, the World Trade Center trees and that kind of thing, but I don't know if that doesn't answer your question, but you know, it is interesting, yeah. They said it was one of the longest run cooperative stores. Anyway, any other questions? Yeah.
Lukens wasn't the only one there. I mean, Worth Brothers had a big
Yes.
facility.
Mm-hmm.
Bethlehem even had a facility there.
Yes.
I'm wondering if you had any information on how they worked together, if they did.
Well, we just did a seminar on Worth Brothers, and what I think is interesting is the Rebecca's grandchildren. You know, they're the two Houston brothers. They were pushing towards open hearth, and then the Worth brothers, whose father was a blacksmith, and they had the blast furnace, and there didn't seem to be any competition, even though the Worth brothers were pushing to have the world's largest plate mill too. And a couple of years they made it, like in 1916, I think they did have the large, you know, these different, they almost did it, but then they were bought out. But Bethlehem, they developed more south Coatesville, but now where Cleveland Cliffs has most of their scrap yards there. But my theory was that they seem to get along, and they didn't really think they're competitive. And at one point, like Lukens had, you know, stainless steel. They could have gone into making that, but another person bought that company. I've forgotten his name now, and he would just call up and order stainless steel things. They would do different things where a short period of time they were, you know, doing the caps for the Nassau, you know, for the early time when they had the Apollo and other things, they did that. But they would be short term. Then they went into doing armor plate. So they would have these products where people come to it, but they weren't, you know. But it is, at one point I told you there was 5 mills, not just Worth Brothers, maybe 4, doing nails and other things there, including the mother and son's mill. Rebecca's brother and her mother had this other competitor. But it's sort of interesting how they had so many mills near there, but no one seemed to. I'm just wondering why there wouldn't be more water rights problems, because right up the Brandywine River, we had lots of textile mills making, like they made Union uniforms in the Civil War and that kind of thing. So they actually had paper mills. I know that there was lawsuits because the textile mill was dumping like dye into the Brandywine, and that was affecting the paper mill, of course. But anyway, but I do. I know no one's really researched that in terms of like how the brothers got along. It seems like they both had similar backgrounds in terms of, you know, their family being in the iron business, because their father was a blacksmith, but he went into business with someone else doing, I think he had a slitting mill too. Anyway, so you're one of the. If you go online, we do have a video in the seminar on the Worth brothers. If you look at our website, steelmuseum.org. And we also have Hagley Museum in Wilmington. It's very big. It's scanned hundreds of our Lukens life. And before that, they had, you know, all these different newsletters. They scanned so many of them. So you could go on their website and you go down to where it says Lukens Life, and you can put any name in there, and you'll find the people. You know, if you have a relative that maybe worked at Bethlehem down there. So anyway, thank you very much, though. Okay.